Fantastic Four First Steps hits theaters this weekend, and coming up on halfway through the decade, I thought I'd give my top 10 comic book movies of the 2020s so far. The beginning of this decade was interesting for filmmaking as a whole, but really the production of comic book movies with the pandemic and the Hollywood strikes. But recently, both the MCU and DCEU have hit a stride. From movies to TV shows, there have been successes and failures, but now we don't have another comic book movie for an entire year. So what better time to do a ranking than now? Let me know your top 10 favorite comic book films of the 2020s in the comments down below, but let's get into it. There have been a lot of comic book movies, and I have a couple of honorable mentions. I really liked The Flash. I don't think it's a perfect movie by any means. The CGI is absolutely horrible, but this movie has so much heart, and it's the first in a long line of modern DC movies that feels like a comic book translated to screen one for one. I do think the character work is interesting. I think the story works really, really well. And I really wonder if not for the Ezra Miller controversy, all of the David Zaslav and Warner Brothers hierarchy and leadership changes, and just the overall shitty production and length that this movie went through to be reshot, recut, and re-CGI'd together, would this have been one of the best comic book films of all time? Black Panther Wakanda Forever is one of the most interesting MCU movies just in terms of all of the story that it had to bring together, and I think it works as good as it could have for the story circumstance. I don't think Shuri is an amazing Black Panther, but I do think on a technical level and most of the character work is great. I just really wish that Namor and the Atlanteans were fleshed out a little bit more. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is a movie I recently rewatched, and it has some of the best action in the entire MCU. I think the way that the final act evolves is something I really want more from in the MCU, and I overall just love the character of Shang-Chi and the world building here. It all is just working at such a great level, especially for an origin story, and I think Wenwu is also one of the most interesting MCU villains. And the final honorable mention, Spider-Man No Way Home. I really loved this movie when it originally came out. Saw it like 4 or 5 times in theaters, watched the extended cut once at home, and I really still love this film, but as time goes on, the production quality of it does diminish for me. I still love the nostalgic aspects of it. I'll be the first to admit, yeah, it worked on me. The ability to find the core character work in Tom Holland's Spider-Man through Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire's versions of Spider-Man is absolutely perfect in my opinion. Yes, it's a little hard reset for the MCU Spider-Man, but I'm still pretty excited to see where they go from here in Spider-Man Brand New Day. In 10th place for me is Eternals. This is one of the most interesting comic book films I've ever seen in my entire life. The idea of fate versus humanity and who you really are and the power that you really do have. That's not to say this film is perfect. I do think there are a plethora of flaws. The first one being that this should have honestly been split up into a TV show. There are way too many characters and so much going on here, but I think the inconsistencies and small amount of time for every single character make the overall story feel a lot more consistent in my opinion, in terms of Tiamets, Celestials, and other big ideas going on in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. My biggest flaw for this film is just the fact that Cersei isn't a very interesting protagonist, but I think all of the outlining characters have enough good story plots going on that it didn't really matter for me. I can't talk about Eternals without talking about Druig. He's one of the most morally interesting characters that the universe has ever introduced, and I don't think we're going to see this character. I don't really think we're going to see most of the Eternals again, but I really do hope that we get some sort of story that continues with these characters, because again, the moral dilemma that these gods versus humans type of story faces, I feel like it's something the DC universe is kind of going down the path of, and I'm really excited to see if the MCU ever goes back to it. In 9th place for me is Deadpool and Wolverine. As a huge fan of Deadpool, I think that overall this movie does a great job of bringing us back to Deadpool 1 and 2, but again, I won't say it's a perfect film. I think it has a lot of visual problems, but past that, I like the characterization of Wolverine a lot and the story that they decided to tell coming off of Logan. This is probably the best use of general multiversal story and ideas we've seen in the MCU thus far. This is like fan service the movie, and if you want to call it slop, I totally understand, and for that reason, I do think some days I like Eternals more and some days I like Deadpool and Wolverine more, but Deadpool and Wolverine is easily the most fun I've had in a theater at a Marvel movie recently, so I think it needs to get its flowers. And 8th place for me is the Fantastic Four First Steps. Everything I thought that would go wrong with this movie did, but I also think the good and the exciting and interesting moments do outweigh the bad to a certain extent. But honestly, I think my 8, 9, and 10 could be swapped around any day depending on what I'm rewatching and how I'm feeling. I've talked about this film so much over the last weekend, but I really do love the overall world that they build here. I just don't think it's utilized enough, and utilized enough stuff into a way where we actually have stakes and care about the characters in this world. I do care about the Fantastic Four singularly, but I don't really care about their dynamic with the rest of the world, because for the second half of the film, they're not even really interacting with the outside world. I think the action is fairly underwhelming for Fantastic Four level powers, but I do think Galactus and Silver Surfer are absolutely phenomenal. I think Silver Surfer especially, Shia LaBeouf is one of the most interesting adaptations of this character that we've ever had. On a technical level, this is absolute peak Marvel. The score from Michael Giacchino is phenomenal, and visually, this feels like it has a true identity, not only on like a CGI level, but also composition, the lighting, but more so also the set design. And yes, it looks really nice. There is no depth to it on a story and writing level, in my opinion, but it does look really cool and it looks different. And I feel like that's what a lot of people wanted. In seventh place for me is Thunderbolts. This is where we take a big leap in the list, in my opinion. I think Thunderbolts and Up are movies that are truly not all-time great comic book films, but all-time interesting to talk about. Thunderbolts really subverts the generic Marvel formula, and this is the first film post-production reboot, as I like to call it. I think Thunderbolts truly takes into account personal storytelling. It's about depression. It's about not feeling like yourself, not being yourself, and finding yourself, the best parts of you, within other people that also have similar trauma. All of this to say, thematically, it is a very heavy movie, but also on a story level, it's just as entertaining. On an action level, it's just as entertaining. It's not necessarily that it's action, but it feels very similar to older mid-2010s Marvel movies. The ensemble works very, very well, and I like that though it does rely on other MCU stories, just like everyone has been in a TV show or a movie prior to this, you're able to actually tell their story in a non-convoluted way, where I feel like Fantastic Four, they went the non-origin story route, set on Earth 828, not the main MCU, and everyone really liked that. But I think this proves that you can still tell stories, and with telling a story about characters that we already know and love and making their stories just a little bit separate. So that creates real stakes with the Void, especially in the final act, and a character as powerful as Sentry. I think this movie flourishes in actually making New York feel like a scary place, and that's just something that I feel like has lacked in a lot of other recent Marvel movies, just in terms of world-ending stakes. The Void feels like that, but sometimes the movie doesn't necessarily convey that. I think they really do a great job here. In sixth place for me is The Suicide Squad. I haven't rewatched this movie in a very long time, but I think about this movie way too often. I think the character work through an ensemble is absolutely perfect, and though I do think my 6 and 7 could be swapped around a little bit, I do think that Thunderbolts works in a completely different way than the Suicide Squad does, in terms of the Suicide Squad is truly unhinged characters doing unhinged things for 2 hours, and I love that. I don't think the emotional gut punch of this film hits as hard for me as I did when I originally watched the film. I really like that the timeline and story in the first half of the film isn't necessarily linear, and to an extent, the entire project feels like an Elseworlds DC project, which kind of it is, kind of it isn't if you talk about Peacemaker in that. In fifth place for me is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. I recently rewatched this one for the first time since I saw it like 2 or 3 times in theaters back in 2023, and I absolutely still love this movie. It is insane the levels that James Gunn is working at here, and it's not just this movie. As I was watching this movie, I realized the evolution of James Gunn in comic book films has been a treat to watch. You look at like just the 2020s alone, and we'll get to Superman in just a second here. Volume 3 is the definition of that, in my opinion. This is where he truly takes the first big swing on a cinematography level, on an action level, and really on a storytelling level, and that's where I think this movie has one very minor flaw, in that I think it's emotionally very all over the place, tonally very all over the place, and it's because they decided to do the rocket flashbacks throughout the entire film. And that's also kind of why I was very hesitant to rewatch this movie. It is so emotionally taxing, and so for that, I think the rewatchability is fairly low, but it is an amazing movie, and when you sit down to watch the film, you just never want to turn it off. It truly works in every single way you want a comic book movie to work. It's emotional, it's exciting, it's entertaining, but at its core, you just care about every single character, no matter if it's a character that was introduced in Volume 2 or introduced in a different project, or just someone he brought back from the dead. I think it's just so interesting how he's able to execute these character dynamics at level 100 for 2.5 hours straight. In fourth place for me is Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Doctor Strange is one of my favorite characters in the entire MCU, and when we got a film titled Multiverse of Madness, I was really scared that it was going to kind of be what Deadpool and Wolverine was, which came out after, so we didn't really know that was a possibility. And I think a lot of people went into Multiverse of Madness expecting what we got in Deadpool and Wolverine, and that just wasn't the case at all. Instead, what we got is something I absolutely loved. We got a very personal story between Christine Palmer and Doctor Strange that's explored by using the multiverse. I think the weakest part of this movie is America Chavez in terms of just like a character, plot point / plot device, but I think it's strengthened by Wanda being such a phenomenal villain, in my opinion. One of the most interesting villains the MCU has ever seen, just because of how much she's been built up and the fact that they were able to defeat her at the end. This was the end of her character arc. Back to Doctor Strange though, I think traveling the multiverse and finding different variants of yourself is the perfect way to execute such a personal story. Christine Palmer is truly the one character that feels like has gotten away from Doctor Strange in the entire world. He's the most egotistical and smart and asshole, arrogant character, probably right behind her equivalent to Tony Stark, and we finally got to see inside of him, break that barrier. I think this is the perfect character study film, and I understand why people don't like it if you're going to see a film called Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, but if you put that aside and you just call it Doctor Strange 2, I do think this is a very, very interesting look into a great character in this world. In third place for me is Superman. This is James Gunn's magnum opus, in my opinion. It is easily his best film, or at least personally my favorite from his. I think David Cornsweet is phenomenal as this character. I really grew up on Tyler Hoechlin's Superman from the CW show Superman and Lois. I was supposed to grow up with Henry Cavill / Zack Snyder's adaptation, but it wasn't really one that appealed to me. I think James Gunn just knows how to build out a world, and I don't think it was a necessity to build out the entire DC universe in one film like he attempts to do here, because I think that makes it a little bit messy. The embodiment of hope is what this movie is, and I feel like a character standing tall and strong throughout all of the troubles that he faces, especially in a film like this that tries to tackle geopolitical problems, character problems, DC Universe world problems, and his own personal family, parents, Krypton lore problems. There's just so much for a character like this to take on, and I think they do a phenomenal job here. Oh yeah, on top of all of this, the action is so cool. It's like the greatest Superman action ever put to the big screen, and I cried when he was like standing in the dust. I was like, yeah, this is straight aura farming, and I needed this 10 years ago. In second place for me is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. This is one of the best, if not the best, animated film of all time, in my opinion. And on top of that, it just works so well in being a long and fleshed out and important multiversal story. I think the personal side of Miles is something that is just so in the forefront throughout the entirety of this franchise thus far, that I think this movie, pushing it so far in your face, talking about his familial side, him leaving to go to the multiverse and trying to escape and come back, the whole idea of canon events in Spider-Man 2099 as the villain, there is so many interesting concepts here, and they somehow execute it all within this, 2.5 hour film. I haven't seen this movie in over a year, but I still really do like it, and I want to rewatch it very soon. I'm really interested to see where the world and the story goes from here. I think there's a lot at stake, and that's the exact thing I wanted from this movie. It does feel like a part one, which I kind of felt like they had kept it a part one title, made this a 1 and 2 situation, kind of like Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, where I know by the end of that, a lot of people didn't think the story was complete. And though I don't think the story is 100% complete here, I still do think it gives us just enough material on a personal level, which I think in the second half of the movie, the film goes to a whole different echelon of what it's trying to do in a multiversal story that we've never really seen before, especially in terms of Spider-Man, that people forget the whole first half of the movie / first act of the movie's plot is so based in the familial stuff with the Morales family that I think we're really getting two great stories meshed into one. And then that kind of leads us into part 2 sometime in 2030, whatever. I don't know when they're making Beyond the Spider-Verse. In first place for me, though, is The Batman. This is the only 5 out of 5 film I have on this list. I've seen this movie over like 13 times. It is one of the greatest films of all time, in my opinion. Matt Reeves is just working on a whole different level here. I don't think that there is a single world, whether it's the DC Universe, DC Elseworld projects, the Marvel Universe, there is no movie thus far, even in the last 10 years, like outside of the 2020s, that has created a world as captivating as Matt Reeves does with Gotham. And on top of just the city being its own character, I think that's why the origin-less story works here. In Superman, it works great because you get context clues throughout the film, but really the only subplot in the Batman that works with that is the stuff with Thomas Wayne. That means there's one very small character subplot that gives us characterization on Batman. why this works as being an origin-less superhero story is because the stakes aren't necessarily within Bruce Wayne or Batman, but it's more so in Gotham and the characters of Gotham, whether it's Selina Kyle, Jim Gordon, the Riddler, the Mayor. The way that this Gotham is evolving is something that is just so entertaining throughout the entirety of this film. Now, general Gotham stuff aside, I think the castings are all-time great. Like, this is genuinely hit for hit. Every single person on this cast list is 10 out of 10 for their role. On a technical level, this is arguably the best comic book film of all time. Greg Fraser was the DP for this film, does a phenomenal job. I think the score by Michael Giacchino is an all-timer. And then you get to the thematic ideas of Batman, and this is where Batman truly flourishes. I don't think we've ever gotten a single adaptation of Batman that is working on the levels that this film is in terms of splitting the personality between Bruce Wayne and Batman. Now, originally when I saw this movie, you know, I wanted a little bit more of Bruce Wayne, and as I saw the movie a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th time, I was like, yeah, no, I don't really give a shit about that. We get so many great context clues and so many great minor character building moments that even if we don't get a Batman Part 2, which I know we are going to, but even separating these two films, I do think there's so much Batman. It is about Batman and how he traverses this world and how he's able to understand and be traumatized by literally every single thing that happens in Gotham. This movie is the definition of a 5 out of 5, a 10 out of 10, a 100 out of 100, the perfect comic book film in my opinion. But guys, that wraps up my ranking for my top 10 favorite comic book films of the decade. As always, I'd love to hear your ranking in the comments down below. Subscribe for more rankings and reviews. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.